And welcome back, AP Econ students. Time for more free response questions from old AP exams. Today we are looking at the AP Micro exam from the year 2017. Alright, so here's what it says. Corn is used as food and as an input in the production of ethanol, an alternative fuel. Assume corn is produced in a perfectly competitive market. Alright, there's what we know. It's a market type question, not surprising, and it's perfect competition, so lock that in. So let's see, part A says, draw correctly labeled side-by-side graphs of the corn market and a representative corn farmer. On your graph show equilibrium price and quantity in the market, got it, and a profit maximizing quantity by the farmer, and it does here say the farmer is earning zero economic profit. So frequently they will say the situation in the original statement, they would say, in fact, in this one they could have said, assume corn is produced in a perfectly competitive market in long-run equilibrium. They should have said that, or could have, but they decided to address it here later in the question. So we're going to draw this side by side, and try to make this as neat as possible, and also make sure we can make these approximately the levels pretty nice. Okay. And so over here is going to be the corn market. So I'm going to title this the corn market. And this is going to be a representative farmer, but I'll just say this is an individual farmer. If you prefer, you could think market and firm, either way. So we have the corn market, and it's just going to be unit elastic. And there's our demand curve, and there's our supply curve. And we have our price and we have our quantity axis here. And so out of equilibrium from the market, we've got Mr. DARP. Okay, and we will label Mr. DARP right here, which is marginal revenue, demand, average revenue, and price. And since we're in long-run equilibrium, where it says we're earning zero economic profit, that means I'm going to draw my ATC sitting right on Mr. DARP, or being tangent right there. And there is my marginal cost curve, and here is quantity. And here is price axis here. I think we have everything. Now we just have to make sure we label it accordingly in the question. So we have the side-by-side graph. We're good there. Now it says equilibrium price and quantity in the market, P sub M and Q sub M. So you want to make sure you make these dotted lines down here. Sometimes they're a little picky about that. So we have Q sub M, and there is P sub M, M meaning market. And then for here it says profit maximizing quantity as a Q sub F. So that's just MR equals MC. Okay, and we will dot down to here, and that will be quantity in the firm or the farm. Okay, I think we're good there for part A. Okay. Now, part B says, assume the demand for ethanol increases. On your graph in part A, show what will happen to each of the following in the short run. The market price, and then the area of profit or loss. Well, let's think about that. If there is an increase in demand for ethanol, then we're going to need more corn to make the ethanol. Therefore, there will be an increase in demand. So what you can show on your graph is just show an increase in demand. Okay, and I'm going to call this D prime. If you want, you can do D sub 1 and D sub 2. But what you can clearly see is we now have a new point of equilibrium. And they say put our new spot here as Q sub asterisk, or it's actually more in an exponent location. So I'm going to put a Q and put an asterisk there. And then over here on the price axis, I'm going to do P with an asterisk. And so you guys make these as big as you need to feel comfortable about it. And that's part 1. And then for part 2, it says the area of profit or loss. Well, you know, if there's an increase in demand, we now just have a new Mr. DARP, because Mr. DARP comes out of equilibrium. So here is my new Mr. DARP. So I'm going to call that Mr. DARP prime right there. And it's not quite parallel, but it's okay. And so the area of profit, well, you got to be careful here because this old Mr. DARP can throw you. So now that this is here, you want to think to yourself, all right, MR equals MC is the rule, so that is right here. There's our new quantity. And it only wants you to shade in the profit. Well, you might be tempted to dot all the way down here and put a new Q value, which Q sub PM, which you could. You wouldn't be penalized for that, but they're not asking for it. But you'd say, well, if this is my new spot right here, I will go ahead and put it there. It's not necessary. But they just want you to shade the profit box. So you'd say, well, if this is my new quantity, there's my revenue. So actually this huge rectangle would be your total revenue. And then going to the cost curve right there, that is where we would have the edge of our profit box. Now you want to be careful when you sketch this. If you remember back when we were in micro, I would frequently tell you the way you know you did this right is that the vertex of your ATC is not in the profit box, and it's not. So make sure when you make your ATC minimum, make sure it comes to a nice point, like a nice solid vertex of a quadratic. I actually made this a little flatter than I normally would, but you want to have a nice point there so that you can clearly, you don't want this to be a muddled mess. That you want to make it very clear that the bottom of your profit box is not old Mr. Dark. In fact, that's what they're testing you on. They're going to see if you're going to do that. And so I could have made my and if you feel uncomfortable with your picture, you can just start over, and I could have made a really steep ATC that would have clearly shown that out of there, but I think we're okay. All right? And so it says the area that profit or loss, not wanting to give it away, and shaded completely. Okay, so there we go. Part C says, relative to your answer in Part B, state what will happen to market equilibrium, price, and quantity in the long run. So all of this was filling things in on the graph, so I'm just going to do, I'm going to put A and B there, and then C I'm going to put in right here what they're asking. So relative to your answer, what happens in the long run? Well, here's what they're looking for. You should know that if profits are being made, profit-seeking entrepreneurs will enter the market. So over here, there would be an increase in supply as firms enter. Well, I'm not going to draw it because it'll mess up the picture. But you could imagine as firms enter, that would be an increase in supply. If there's an increase in supply, it's going to bring Mr. Dark back down. So I'm going to draw this over here. Real small here. So here's what we had originally. There was our supply and demand curve. And we said there was an increase in demand for ethanol. Well, here was D prime. Well, this resulted in a profit over here, so firms would enter. So I'm going to circle that as point A. And this is our new higher price, higher quantity. But firms will enter. And that would be S prime, and that's going to pull it back down to here. So what you're wanting to see is that the price is here, but it's going to come down when firms enter. It'll come back down, possibly to old equilibrium, but the quantity is definitely going to increase. So there's no question quantity increases and price decreases here. So that's what they're looking for, and you need to explain your answer. And so you can say, firms will enter. Firms will enter the market in the long run. Which lowers market price and increases the quantity. And you would have everything covered there. So the explanation is really that firms will enter. So a nice, concise answer is all you need. And it's addressing, and if you want to make sure you get your point for what's going to happen, and you're concerned about your explanation, at least just get your points for lower market price, increased quantity. So lower price, increased quantity, get your point, and then because firms will enter the market. Okay, and seeking profits, and so make sure you at least say what's going to happen to get the easier of the 2 points. Okay, now let's go to part D. So part D says, soybeans are produced in a perfectly competitive market. Assume farmers can grow either corn or soybeans on the same land. What happens to the price of soybeans in the next planting season if the price of corn increases? Explain. Well, what I'm going to do just to explain this, I'll just draw this here before I write my explanation. You don't have to draw the graph, but you could if you wanted. You can just say, well, what's going to happen over here in the soybean market? So you just think about it. So all of the soybean farmers, they have an opportunity to plant corn instead. So if the ethanol demand is really high and you're sitting there and you're like, well, I'm not going to grow soybeans, I'm going to grow corn instead. So what will happen in the soybean market? Well, there'll be a decrease in supply of soybeans because more people are going to grow corn. So you guys can see what happens to the price. We were right here. Well, price is clearly going up and our quantity is going down. All right, and that's what they're wanting. So if you wanted, you could have the graph there to help with your explanation, but all you have to write here, we're going to say soybean prices will increase. Soybean prices will increase and quantity will decrease as the supply of soybeans decreases due to more corn. Get this out of the way. Due to more corn being planted. Okay? And that addresses why we're going to be planting soybean or corn instead of soybeans, and so the soybean supply decreases. And again, it's not a bad idea if you want to have that little sketch there illustrating what you're saying. Okay, let's look at the last part, E. It says, assume instead that the government sets a binding price ceiling in the corn market. Draw a new correctly labeled graph of the corn market and show each of the following. A binding price ceiling. So when you guys hear the word binding, it just means it's having an impact. So if it's a binding price ceiling, it better look like a floor. So, supply, demand, and so here is our quantity, and here is our price. And they want you to put in a binding price ceiling. Well, it better look like a floor, so it needs to be below equilibrium. And they want us to label it PC. So this is the price sub C, which means price ceiling. You could put it here too, which we frequently do. So there's our price ceiling. So it's a ceiling because the price can't rise. It's going to hit the ceiling. Okay? And so these 2 points wind up being very important. Now, when you guys see a price ceiling, you should know, well, the quantity demanded is right here, the quantity supplied. We're going to have a shortage. So this thing says, draw a newly labeled graph. Okay, we have part 1, we labeled the price ceiling. Part 2, the quantity purchased by consumers in the corn market. We got to be careful here. This right here is going to be the quantity demanded. This is going to be the quantity supplied. There will be a shortage. In fact, we're going to run out of corn. This was the corn market. We're going to run out of corn. So the question says, what is the quantity purchased? You don't want to accidentally say, well, that's the quantity demanded. That's not going to be the quantity purchased because we're going to run out because of the shortage. So the correctly labeled spot which says, what's the quantity purchased? It's right here, Q sub P. Because they're going to purchase everything available and then we're going to have a shortage. Okay? So that is question 1, which was more typical than not, where you get a market and it's all questions about this particular market. So in this one they did perfect competition, and they could have done imperfect. So this would probably mean if they chose to go perfect early in the question, then later in the question will probably be something about imperfect. So there's number 1. Time now to move on to number 2. All right, question number 2 is about the resource market. So if you remember when we went through in micro in the circular flow, if you remember we would leave our house. We had households and individuals, so we'd say households and individuals, and we would say you would go to the goods market, you would go to the POG, or you would go to the RIF, if you recall that. Just sketch this really quickly, and then over here we have the businesses and firms, and we would do the circular flow of money. And if you went this way, you would spend your money, and if you went this way, you were a resource, and if you went this way, you were a customer. And over here, you were the demander, and the businesses supplied, but up here, the businesses demand, and you are the supply. And the resource market in the POG, if you recall, we had perfect competition, and imperfect competition. And then we had three different types here. We had monopolistic competition, oligopolies, and monopolies, and here we just had perfect competition. So we had 4 types of marketplaces within the POG, but in the RIF we had 2 types, and we had perfect competition, and we had a monopsony. There was only 2. And if you recall, this was the one where we had Mr. Carlson and Mr. Poulsen, had that little graph there, if you remember. Well, this question is about the resource market, and it's a little bit obscure and kind of odd the way they presented it, and the results for this particular year on this question were kind of low. But it wasn't quite as straightforward a resource market question as you would think. So they kind of did it in a little goofy way. It's a little bit hard to follow, but once you see it all, it'll probably make sense. But this is all a part of the benefit of always reviewing old APs, so you can kind of get used to their style, though this was a little bit peculiar. So here we go. This says the table below shows the output a firm produces using different amounts of capital and labor. So those are 2 resources. The markets for capital and labor are perfectly competitive, so that's going to be important. The rental rate of capital is $75 an hour, and the wage rate for the people are $200 per unit. In the short run, capital is fixed and labor varies. Okay, so let's look at this chart here. This is kind of confusing. And so it might be helpful for you to imagine a piece of equipment. And so here's our labor column right here. And then here is the output with a certain amount of capital. Now that capital we're referring to, like this could be, maybe this is a restaurant, this is a cook, and each one of these represents one of the ovens. And if he has working by himself with 1 oven, he can make 10 pizzas. We'll use that one. But if you give him 2 ovens, he can make 2 pizzas. So if you'll notice, he can double his productivity, or the productivity doubles here if you have just twice as much capital. So maybe it's just something like 2 ovens, and this one doesn't go perfectly to 76, but it goes 75, but these 2 double. And you can say, okay, so if you give me twice as much equipment, I can actually produce twice as much. Okay, and then let's look what happens as we hire more people. You hire 1 person, even with just, we'll say, 1 oven, they can make 10. If you hire a second person, you can more than double your output. That's a really important thing to notice. And then if you hire a third person, well, let's look at this on the margin. The difference between hiring the first person and the second person, you increased your output by 15 units. It's an important thing to notice. And then if you hire the next person, that was still a really good hire. You increased your output by 13. So the second hire was really great. The third one was still really good. And what you want this to be thinking of is, this was way back in micro. If you remember, we had our 3 phases where we had increasing marginal returns, decreasing marginal returns, negative marginal returns. And we had the 3 phases of productivity. And this was our marginal product curve. So it was increasing, decreasing, negative. And we used this even way back with our widget factory. When we were hiring people, theoretically, there comes a point as you're hiring people, this is your productivity here. And as you hire people, these are in this phase right here, each person you hire, those are great hires. They keep making more stuff at an increasing marginal return rate. These people are still good hires, and the last person you hire is right here. And remember, this isn't about the quality of the person you're hiring, it's about fixed resources that you've maximized your situation for the number of people you hired. And this is when marginal product goes to 0. So after that, you hire too many people, they're in each other's way, they're standing around because they don't have equipment. This is not where you want to go. So we had those 3 phases. That's kind of what it's doing right here. So it looks like right here, if you guys notice, hiring the first to the second person, that second person was just a great hire. It was increasing from the first one, but the third person hired was still good, but they only increased by 13 instead of 15, if you want to notice that. And you could do the same thing if we had the 2 things. So if it helps you, you could think, let's just, for a silly example, this is a pizza shop, here's the employees, and these are ovens, and that's how you read this. The output based on the amount of people you hire and the amount of equipment they have access to. So in the best scenario, you've hired 3 people, and we've got 2 ovens running, and we can make 75 pizzas, we'll say. So this is our column with 2 ovens running. This is our column with just 1 oven, and you kind of see what's going on. Obviously, if nobody's hired, it doesn't matter. Whether you have 1 or 2 ovens, there's nobody using them, nothing gets made. So once you kind of get a handle on that, it's like, okay, at least I got a feel for what's going on. And now we're going to see what's going on. Now, quick review real fast, too. If you remember in Perfect Competition, we had Mr. Poulsen. Now, if you remember, the Mr. Poulsen curve was a demand curve, but really it was that productivity curve like that. And the reason we called it Mr. Poulsen was the marginal revenue of the product. Okay? And then we had good old Mr. Carlson right here, and he was the marginal resource cost. When your marginal resource cost doesn't change, that's what you would have. And this is the sweet spot. How many people do you hire? You hire until, remember right here, all of these people are bringing in more money than they cost you, and right here, this last person you hire, they cost you what they're bringing in, and that's the last hire. And you don't hire past here. This would be inefficient. They're costing you more than you're hiring. So this was the resource graph. Okay, so let's go ahead and see what we can do here with A. And a lot of students had trouble with this question, just even understanding the way the chart was made, and it was a little bit weird, but I think you got a feel for it now. So it says, if the firm uses 1 unit of capital and 1 unit of labor, will it be operating with constant, increasing, or decreasing returns to scale? Now that phrase threw a lot of students also. I know I just erased this here, but as far as returns to scale, there's a connection with the long-run average total cost curve, where we had this, where we had economies of scale, we had constant returns to scale, and then we had diseconomies of scale, if you remember that. And so this would be, we are having decreasing, we're in economies of scale, constant returns, diseconomies, but then there was also this, the graph I just made with marginal product, where we had this right here. And we had these 3 phases. And there was a couple different ways you could look at this question. It says, which one of these phases are we in? Are we looking at this one, or this one? There's actually, it's more of this graph, but they use the term constant, and that's what kind of threw people. So, again, it was a confusing way it was presented, but here's what they meant. If the firm uses 1 unit of capital, so let's look at this column right here. So they're using 1 unit of capital and 1 unit of labor. So it's one guy working, making 10 pizzas, we'll say. Will it be operating with constant, increasing, or decreasing returns to scale? Explain using the numbers from the table. So what they're asking without saying it, or the way you answer this question is, what happens if you keep hiring people? Do you make more stuff, less stuff, or the same proportion? So, let me give you an example. What happens if you use 1 piece of capital and you hire another person? If you hire another person, you are more than doubling your output. If this would have been a 20, you would have said, okay, with 1 guy I make 10, with 2 guys I make 20, I'm at a constant return. I'm not making any more. But what you're noticing is when you hire somebody else, you make more than double. Well, if you're making more than double, the idea here is, are you in increasing, it's not constant, is it increasing or decreasing returns to scale? We have increasing returns to scale because we more than doubled when we hired somebody else. Now, and it got even more so over here, going 20 to 30. And so what we're going to say is we're going to say increasing. Increasing because additional labor more than doubled output. More than doubled the output. And if it would have just doubled, you would have been constant. But it more than doubled output. And if it would have been less than double, if it would have, let's say this number would have been 15, hiring another person only made 5, well then we would be decreasing. And so the one I want you to be thinking about is, of these the graphs I drew, I want you to be thinking about right here. This never had a constant phase. It was, are you in increasing marginal returns or decreasing marginal returns? And it would have been better if it would have said, or negative marginal returns. We on this, when we made this graph, we never had an option for constant anyway, and that's another reason why it was confusing. So basically what it's saying is, which one of the phases are you in? And you just say, oh, it's increasing. Increasing marginal returns went from 10 and went to 15. That's the way we're at. Okay? And there's your answer. All right, part B. Part B says, assume that the firm currently has 2 units of capital. All right, so we're in this column, and we've hired 3 units of labor. Okay, so we're in this situation right here. Very important that you say, okay, well, it looks like we're looking at this. We're making 75 pizzas, we could say. Calculate the marginal product for the 3rd unit of labor. Okay, well, marginal product, again, if for students that had trouble reading this, it was kind of frustrating, but here's what I want you to see. We've already stated we're going to use 2 units of we're using 2 ovens. So what was the marginal product of hiring the 3rd unit of labor? Well, when you had 2 guys working, you were making 50 pizzas. You hired the 3rd guy, you're making 75. The marginal product of the 3rd guy is 25. Okay? And so technically, where it says here, show your work, it's kind of silly, but we would say, oh, well, I guess it is 75 minus 50, and then the 3rd guy working minus the guy before him. We would do it this way, and you'd get 25 over 1, and that's your answer. There's your showing your work. I would actually probably just do 75 minus 50 and get 25. Okay, so there's your marginal product. And that was 1. All right, let's see what happens for 2. 2 says, did the firm experience diminishing marginal returns with the addition of the 3rd unit of labor? Now remember, back over here, we have increasing marginal returns, we have decreasing marginal returns, and we have negative marginal returns. Okay? So, they do use the term marginal return, and it's a little bit slang here on the returns to scale thing where I was saying what I was saying here. And so you can use this concept, or you could use the average total cost curve, either way. But this one specifically is addressing here on marginal return. So when we hired the 3rd person, here's what you want to notice. When we hired the 3rd person, we went from 50 to 75, but look what happened when we went from the 1st to the 2nd. We were making 20 pizzas, and then we increased by 30, but now we're increasing by 25. Still a good hire, but we hired, the next hire made a little less than the one before, so we're in this phase. Good hire, but making less than the ones that were in the increasing phase. So the question says, did you experience diminishing marginal returns with the addition of the 3rd unit of labor? Explain, and the answer would be yes, we did. Yes. The marginal product of the 2nd worker was 30. And we already said it in the last question. And the marginal product of the 3rd worker, or 3rd unit, decreased to 25. So we are in the diminishing one. Okay. Time for the 3rd one. 3rd one says, calculate the firm's average total cost for its current level of production and show your work. All right, so we got to go back to the original here, and it says, assume now the firm is operating with 3 and 2, and we just go back to the original and we calculate it. So we're using 3 units of labor, and it says each unit of labor costs us $200. Okay, and then we're going to add to that. We're going to add to that the 2 units of capital, and that says it's 75. Okay, not big math here. So what do we have here? 600 plus 150. So it looks like our average total cost is equal to $750. Sorry, that's not our average. That's our total costs. So our total costs are $750. Okay, so this is equal to our total costs. Now, if you recall, if you want to have your average total costs, you're going to divide by output. So ATC, average total cost, is equal to your total cost divided by output. Okay, so we have to take our 750 and divide it by how much stuff we made. Well, we made 75 pizzas, so 750 divided by 75 is equal to $10 is our average total cost. Okay, on the average. Might not be bad, actually, for a pizza example. That's our average total cost, $10. Okay? Now, the very last part, run out of room, I'll just get this out of the way. And the very last part of the question, I'll put this right here, is 4. All right, and it says, if the firm's output is sold in a competitive market, what's the lowest output price at which the third unit of labor would be hired. Now, I just erased this, but I'm going to put this back up here. If you remember, here's your marginal resource cost, and here's your marginal revenue of the product, Mr. Paulson and Mr. Carlson. So you got to remember here, how much money is what you're making bringing in? Okay, we're making more money with you, but then right after here, the costs, Mr. Carlson is higher than Mr. Paulson. Costs are more than the revenue you bring in, we don't hire you. So this is our last hire right here. So the question is, how much would we have to bring in? Well, we have to make sure that we're covering how much you're costing. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to say, well, if we hire this guy, we have to cover our labor costs. And so if you remember back down here, our labor was costing us $600. Okay, so the labor was $600. Now, if we divide that by the output, let's see what we have to make to cover to see if they're worth it. So if we just divide 600 by 75, you are going to get 8. Not real big math there. So that $8 amount, that's going to tell us that we're going to have to be bringing in over here $8 in order to cover the costs. And so all you had to do was take out the capital expense to focus on just the labor. So if the pizzas we're making sold in a competitive market, what's the lowest price we'd have to bring in to get that would be $8. Okay, so remember that one does not include the price of the capital. This is just the labor part of the market. Okay, so that could be a little confusing. All right, so that is part 4. Resource market question, again, a little bit goofy. And again, when this is taken into context with an entire test of 60 multiple choice and the 3 free response, having a lower score in this question was not a big deal at all. It was balanced in. So I doubt they would go this route here for the 2020 exam, but that is what we had in 2017. Now, question number 3. I'm just going to put this on here right now. Question number 3 on this particular year, just to emphasize to you guys, for both micro and macro, micro has no Unit 6. Now, I don't always follow the outline the way they have it on the AP, but no Unit 6 means no externalities. And if you guys recall, externalities, which are actually kind of fun, remember Bub Rub and Little Sis and the whistle stops? That was the externality section. And that happened when we had marginal social benefits and marginal social costs. And we would have externalities where smoking was the good example, where you just you don't account for the cost of your smoking on other people. You have a private cost. There's a private cost and a social cost, and we would talk about externalities. Well, that's not going to be covered, and the reason is there's some schools that are doing micro in the second semester, and they ran out of time. So micro is no Unit 6, neither is macro, but that's foreign exchange. We'll talk about that another time. So question number 3 on this 2017 exam was marginal social benefit, marginal social cost curve, so that is not going to be addressed. So for the 2017 review, all you need to worry about is question number 1 and question number 2. All right? Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.